It all started on a normal day in Denver, or so we thought. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. But something was off, something that no one could quite put their finger on. It started subtly at first, like a quiet murmur beneath the surface of the calm. People were acting strange, more tired than usual, irritated for no clear reason, and distant in their interactions. It wasn't an obvious change at first, but if you paid close attention, you could feel it. People began to snap at each other, tempers flaring over the smallest of things. Friends who were once close barely exchanged a word, and the smiles that had once come easily seemed forced, like they were trying to hold on to something they couldn't understand. Then came the missing persons reports. It wasn't uncommon for people to go missing in a large city like Denver. Sometimes they ran off. Sometimes they just lost touch. But the sheer number of disappearances over the next few days was troubling. It started with just a few. An elderly man who wandered off from his home. A college student who never made it back from a late-night study session. Nothing that screamed danger. Just sad, but nothing to worry about. Right? The reports kept coming, and more people seemed to vanish without a trace. The local news was filled with unsettling stories of these disappearances, but authorities couldn't make sense of it. They brushed it off as random occurrences, even when the pattern began to form. The real alarm bells didn't start ringing until a few days later, when the first body was discovered. It wasn't like any ordinary crime scene. A janitor at a downtown office building found the body late at night, tossed carelessly in a dumpster behind the building. Its flesh mangled beyond recognition. The man had been torn apart, bites all over his body, some of them so deep they punctured bone. There was no sign of a struggle, no weapon, just the brutal evidence of something primal. The police didn't know what to think at first. Maybe it was a gang-related crime, or perhaps a personal attack gone horribly wrong. But the more they looked, the more questions arose. The body showed signs of being scavenged. Bits of flesh had been torn off and eaten, like something had fed on it. But who or what would do that? They couldn't say. As the investigation dragged on, more reports started to pour in, but this time they were different. People spoke of attacks, strange attacks, where the victims were almost possessed. They described people walking toward them, with vacant eyes moving in jerky, unnatural ways. Some even claimed to have seen their own family members act strangely. Eyes glazed over, movements erratic. They'd snap out of it for a second, only to return to their disturbing, trance-like states. The authorities dismissed it as panic, as people overreacting to the stress of living in a big city, the pressure of work, relationships, life. But it wasn't long before something far more terrifying was happening in Denver, and there would be no denying it any longer. It was late one evening when the first signs of what was to come appeared, first in whispers, then in screams. A young woman in her early 20s was found wandering the streets, covered in blood. Her clothes were ripped to shreds, and her hair was matted with something dark and sticky. She was disoriented, her eyes wide in fear, but there was something chilling about the way she moved. Her steps were slow, uneven, like she was fighting to keep her balance. When people tried to approach her to help, she attacked. She lunged at them with frightening speed, sinking her teeth into the arm of one man who was trying to pull her away. She bit into him with savage hunger, like an animal, and it wasn't until another bystander. The police arrived soon after, but they were at a loss. They didn't know what to make of it. They had assumed it was some kind of drug-induced attack. But when they saw the blood on her mouth, when they saw the man she'd bitten, he was showing the same signs of madness, the same wild look in his eyes, the same violent, animalistic behavior. Things began to change. People were starting to talk, but the truth was too terrifying to even consider. This wasn't just some isolated incident, not a random act of violence. There was something else at play here, something darker. But what? Word spread fast through the city, through whispers at bars, through frantic texts and phone calls. People started to feel uneasy, as if something invisible was pulling them toward the edge of fear. The rumors began to take shape. They called it the infection. No one knew how it spread or why, but those who had been bitten didn't seem to stay the same. They became different. They became violent, aggressive, and most chillingly, they began to hunger for flesh. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents now. It was spreading fast, infecting more and more people in the city. Denver was falling apart, and no one knew how to stop it. The authorities were still slow to respond, unsure of what they were dealing with. Was it a virus? A chemical outbreak? A new form of madness? At first, the city wasn't even placed under quarantine. It took days before the mayor and police chief finally admitted they had a serious problem on their hands. But by that time, it was already too late. People were panicking. Families were hoarding food and supplies, barricading themselves inside their homes. But not everyone could be safe. The infection spread like wildfire, infecting more people each day. It was everywhere, and no one could escape it. As the days turned into weeks, Denver began to feel like a ghost town. Buildings were abandoned. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of something shambling in the distance. The survivors were running out of time, and worse, they were running out of hope. They didn't know what was happening or how to fight it. They didn't even know if anyone outside of the city knew what was going on. All they knew was that the nightmare had only just begun, and what they thought was a normal day in Denver was now a horrifying reality they couldn't escape. No one knew who would be next. No one knew if there was any escape. All they knew was that the infection was spreading, and soon no one would be safe. The worst was yet to come, and no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. It was a Tuesday, just another ordinary evening in Denver. Or, at least, that's what Emily thought, as she wiped down the last of the glasses in the small, dimly lit dive bar where she worked. The jukebox in the corner was playing some old classic rock, barely audible over the soft murmur of the remaining customers chatting and nursing their drinks. The bar was nearly empty by now, with just a few regulars finishing up their beers and chatting quietly. The city outside was still alive with the usual traffic hum, the sounds of late-night hustle, the occasional honk of a car horn. Emily, tired from a long shift, was looking forward to getting out of there, locking up and heading home to her small apartment a few blocks away. She was nearly done when she heard something strange. Footsteps. At first, she didn't think much of it. There were always late-night stragglers. A man was standing at the entrance to the bar, staring at her with wide, vacant eyes. His face was pale, almost as if he hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. But it wasn't just his face. It was his eyes. They were too wide, too unblinking. It was as if he had seen something that broke him inside, something so awful that it left him hollow and empty. Emily felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she locked eyes with him, unable to look away. Before she could say anything, a man lunged at her. His movement was jerky, uncoordinated, but there was a raw, primal urgency in it. His mouth was open wide, his teeth bared like an animal in a frenzy. Emily barely managed to duck as he came at her, his hands reaching out. Instinct took over. She shoved him hard, sending him crashing back into a nearby table. The man staggered, but quickly regained his balance, his eyes never leaving her. She could see the rage, the madness in them. He wasn't human anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't a man anymore. It was something else, something worse. Without thinking, Emily bolted for the back door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she threw herself out into the alley, the cold Denver night air biting at her skin. She didn't look back, her feet pounding against the pavement as she ran down the narrow alleyways. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind racing. What had just happened? Who was that man? What did he want? Her head was spinning, but one thing was clear. Whatever was going on, it was far from over. As she ran deeper into the alley, she stopped dead in her tracks. What she saw next still haunted her to this day. The street was filled with them. People, no, things, roaming the roads, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their skin was pale, their faces contorted in an unnatural snarl. Their mouths were covered in blood, dripping down their chins like they had just finished a gruesome meal, and they weren't stopping. They were moving in the direction of the nearby buildings. their steps slow and deliberate. But every so often, one of them would lunge at a passerby or at another group of people. Emily's stomach turned as she watched in horror. They were eating people. The first thought that came to her mind was that this couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of twisted prank, a bizarre flash mob, or a Halloween event gone wrong. But as she stood there, frozen in place, she saw the truth. These weren't costumes. These weren't people acting out some sick joke. This was real. The people, things, were eating others, tearing at flesh like ravenous animals. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was witnessing. She wanted to scream, to run back into the bar, to lock herself away from whatever nightmare had taken over her city. But she didn't have time. They were getting closer. The alleyway she was in wasn't a safe escape anymore. She had to move fast. Her legs finally found the strength to move again, and she ran. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away from that scene, from those things that were devouring people in the middle of the street. She heard their groans, their snarls, the sickening crunch of bones being snapped apart. The sound haunted her as she ran. The image of blood-soaked streets forever burned into her mind. Emily kept running, her feet stumbling, her mind racing. How many of them were there? How far had this infection spread? She had no idea, but one thing was certain. Denver was no longer the city she had known. It was a battleground now, a city under siege by something she couldn't explain, something she couldn't understand. The attacks weren't stopping. They were spreading. By the time Emily reached the corner of the block, she saw even more of them. Some of them walking aimlessly down the street, others still tearing into the helpless. Her heart raced in her chest as she realized the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a one-off attack. It was happening everywhere. Denver was falling apart. She didn't stop running until she reached a small, hidden alley near her apartment. Her body was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she huddled against the wall, trying to collect herself. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what the hell was happening. But the only thing she could think about was the terrifying images of those blood-soaked people, the screams, and the horror. There was no escaping it now. It had begun. The city was under attack, and it wasn't just a matter of surviving. It was a fight for life. The infection was real, and it was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Emily knew that Denver was no longer safe, that it was no longer the city she had known. She could feel it deep in her bones. This was just the beginning, and there was no going back. The attack had started, and no one knew how bad it would get. But one thing was clear. Whatever these creatures were, whatever had caused this nightmare, it was going to change everything, for everyone. And there was no escaping it. Not now, not anymore. By the time the government realized how serious the situation was, it was already too late. The infection had spread like wildfire. leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. The authorities had initially underestimated the severity of the outbreak. They thought it was a small-scale problem, something contained to a few isolated incidents. But by the time they had grasped the full scale of the threat, the city was already teetering on the brink of collapse. It began with small pockets of panic, reports of strange attacks, and a few isolated disappearances. But soon, it became clear. The infection was everywhere. People were trapped inside their homes, barricading doors and windows, afraid to go out for fear of being attacked. The streets, once bustling with the everyday noise of city life, were now eerily silent, broken only by the occasional shriek of terror or the sound of shuffling feet. The city had turned into a ghost town, and the few who dared venture out didn't return. The first real signs of the outbreak hitting critical mass came in the form of news reports. The television stations were flooded with breaking stories, frantic updates from reporters trying to make sense of the madness. The reports became more frequent, each one worse than the last. At first, they talked about the strange new disease spreading across neighborhoods. People were dying suddenly, their bodies found mangled, often torn apart. But it wasn't until they started showing footage of the infected that the full scale of the horror sank in. News footage from various parts of Denver showed scenes that could have come straight from a horror film. Streets once filled with people going about their daily lives were now overrun by hordes of zombies. The undead moved in large, staggering masses. Their eyes glazed over, their skin decayed and rotting. But what made this outbreak different from any horror story people had ever seen was how fast these zombies were. They weren't slow, like the lumbering creatures of old movies. No, these zombies were fast, terrifyingly fast, and they were relentless. The infection didn't just turn them into mindless creatures. It turned them into predators, hungry for flesh and determined to tear apart anything in their path. As reports of these rampaging zombies spread, people began to realize that there was no escape. The infection didn't discriminate. It didn't matter if you were young or old, rich or poor. It didn't matter if you had a family or were alone. Once you were infected, there was no turning back. The city's hospitals were overwhelmed with the injured, but there was nothing they could do. The doctors and nurses could only treat the wounded as best as they could. But when the infected started showing up in the ER, it was clear that this wasn't a disease they could cure. They were left to watch as their colleagues and patients alike became the very monsters they had been trying to save people from. The city's emergency response was equally chaotic. The Denver Police Department had mobilized quickly, but they were woefully unprepared for the scale of the outbreak. Officers tried to protect civilians, setting up barricades and securing neighborhoods. But the sheer number of infected was too overwhelming. Every time they thought they had pushed back a group, more would appear. The streets were clogged with cars, people desperately trying to escape. But it was impossible to move through the city. The roads were jammed, and in the chaos, people abandoned their vehicles, running on foot, only to become easy targets for the zombies. Soon, the police were forced to retreat, and the National Guard was called in. The military set up perimeters, brought in armed vehicles, and tried to regain control of the city. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they could push the military was better equipped than the police, but they quickly found themselves fighting a losing battle. The undead didn't care about tactics. They didn't care about strategy. They only cared about one thing: feeding. No matter how many were gunned down, more kept coming, and each one was just as vicious as the last. The military set up barricades at every major intersection, trying to keep the zombies contained, but the undead didn't stop. They tore through anything that stood in their way: barricades, fences, even armed soldiers. They were relentless, tearing through barriers as if they were made of paper. The National Guard's lines began to break down, and soldiers started to fall. It was every man for himself. Civilians and military alike were forced into desperate situations. The government's response was slow and disorganized. By the time they tried to implement evacuation plans, it was already too late. The infection had already spread far beyond their control. The mayor of Denver was seen on television, pleading for help from the federal government, but his voice was barely heard over the chaos. The President of the United States issued a statement declaring a national emergency, but the message was lost in the madness. There was no help coming. No one could stop the tidal wave of death and destruction that was consuming the city. Within hours, entire neighborhoods were overrun. The once bustling downtown area became a war zone. People who had once walked the streets with ease were now running for their lives, dodging undead that lurched and chased after them. The once thriving city of Denver had turned into a battleground, with the dead fighting for survival alongside the living. Everyone was fighting for their lives, but as the hours wore on, it became clearer that there was no safe place left. The infected were everywhere. The army had been pushed back. The police were outnumbered, and the survivors were left with only one choice: fight or die. As the days passed, the city descended into total chaos. The government abandoned Denver, and the survivors were left to fend for themselves. The streets were filled with the bodies of the fallen, both human and undead. Those who had managed to escape into the surrounding mountains or nearby towns were forced to stay hidden, knowing that the infection was spreading and that soon the entire country would be under siege. It wasn't just Denver that was falling. It was the entire world. The infection was spreading like wildfire, and the world was unprepared. The zombie apocalypse had begun, and no one knew how to stop it. Denver was just the beginning. And what had started as a small outbreak in one city was now a full-blown disaster that would change the world forever. The city of Denver, once a thriving metropolis, had become a symbol of humanity's helplessness in the face of the unknown. It had fallen, and there was no turning back. The dead had risen, and the living were now fighting for a chance to survive in a world that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. Amid the chaos of Denver's collapsing streets, a small group of survivors huddled together, searching for any semblance of safety in a world that had turned into a nightmare. Their refuge was an old, abandoned building tucked away in a part of the city that seemed to have been forgotten. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the air smelled of mold and decay. But it was one of the few places left untouched by the undead. The building, a relic of a time before the chaos. The group was small, only 5 people, but it was enough to form a bond in the face of adversity. Megan, a nurse by profession, was the one who kept them all going. Her calm demeanor, even in the face of unimaginable terror, gave them a sense of stability. She had tended to the wounded, patched up cuts and bruises, and tried to keep everyone's spirits up, though deep down, she knew the world they once knew was gone. Jason, a mechanic who had been working on cars before the outbreak, was the muscle of the group. His hands were rough from years of working with engines and tools, but now they were just as useful in scavenging for supplies or defending the group against the occasional zombie that wandered too close. He had quickly adapted to this new world, where physical strength and quick thinking were all that mattered. Samuel, a high school teacher, had become the group's strategist. His mind was sharp, always analyzing the situation, trying to come up with a plan for survival. He had been in the classroom when the outbreak first began, and his quiet, thoughtful nature made him a calming presence among the panic. He often looked out for the younger survivors, trying to keep them grounded in the face of fear. They had all come together by chance. Some had known each other from before. Megan and Samuel had met years ago at a community event, and Jason had crossed paths with Megan a few times during his work as a mechanic. But now, they were bound by something much deeper than casual acquaintanceship. In this new world, they had become a family. They shared food, water, and whatever scraps they could find, all while they spent their days in relative silence, too afraid to speak of what they all knew was happening. Every so often, they'd try to piece together the puzzle of how this nightmare began. But every theory they came up with seemed just as impossible as the one before it. There were whispers of a virus, some sort of plague that had turned people into the monsters they now faced. Others talked about chemical warfare, about the possibility that this was all part of some twisted experiment gone wrong. But no one really knew the truth. The outbreak had spread so quickly, and the government's response had been so inadequate that it felt like the answers didn't matter anymore. The world had changed, and no matter how hard they searched for answers, they couldn't undo what had been done. Then, one night, just as the group was settling in for another tense evening. There was a knock at the door. It was a sound they hadn't heard in days, and it froze them all in place. No one dared to answer it immediately. They all exchanged wary glances, unsure of who or what was on the other side. It had been days since they had seen anyone other than themselves, and the thought of another person, let alone a stranger, was enough to make them nervous. But then they heard the muffled sound of someone calling out weakly. It was a man's voice, barely audible, but it was unmistakably human. Megan, always the compassionate one, slowly approached the door. She peeked through a crack in the wall and saw the figure of a man stumbling toward them. His clothes were torn, his face bruised and bloody, and his eyes had a haunted look to them. He was barely standing, leaning on the doorframe for support. Without hesitation, Megan opened the door, just enough for the man to slip inside. The others tensed, their hands instinctively reaching for whatever weapons they had. Baseball bats, knives, and the few guns they'd managed to scavenge. But there was something about the man's broken appearance that kept them from attacking. He wasn't the typical zombie they had come to fear. He was human. Or at least, he seemed to be. The man collapsed to the ground as soon as he was inside. His breath coming in ragged gasps. Megan rushed to his side, kneeling beside him and checking for any signs of infection. But to her surprise, there were none. His skin wasn't decaying, and his eyes were still clear, despite the exhaustion written all over his face. I need to tell you something, the man muttered, barely able to speak above a whisper. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days. The group crowded around him, eager for any information he might have. They had been living in the dark for so long, desperate for answers. The man's name, he explained, was Mark. He was a scientist, an old researcher who had been working on a secret project in a lab just outside the city when the outbreak began. He had been locked in the lab when the infection first hit, and he had barely managed to escape with his life. Mark was bruised, battered, and barely hanging on, but his story sent a chill through the group. He explained that the outbreak wasn't some random virus or natural disaster. It was the result of an experiment gone terribly wrong. Mark had been working on a new kind of medicine. Instead of creating stronger humans, the drug turned people into something else entirely. The infected were no longer human. They were something else. Something that could only be described as the undead. And the worst part, the outbreak had spread quickly, faster than anyone could have prepared for. It wasn't just a virus. It was a chemical weapon, a biological disaster that was completely out of control. Mark told them that there might be a cure, a way to stop the infection before it wiped out humanity completely. But the cure wasn't something that could be synthesized in a lab. It was something much more dangerous. The formula for the antidote was locked away in the heart of the city, deep inside a research facility that had been overrun by the undead. It was their only hope, but getting to it would be nearly impossible. The survivors listened in stunned silence as Mark's words sank in. It was more than they could process. The nightmare that had destroyed their city wasn't an accident. It was a man-made catastrophe. A weapon designed to enhance human power had instead unleashed hell on Earth. And now, with the city overrun, the only way to stop the madness was to find the cure, hidden in the center of the very place that had given birth to the nightmare. But getting there, Mark warned, would be a journey fraught with danger. The undead roamed every corner, and the city itself was a war zone. But it was their only chance. They had no choice but to try. The decision to go after the cure was not an easy one, but it was the only option left for the survivors. There was no hope for survival without it. The world they knew was gone. The streets of Denver had turned into a battlefield, and the once bustling city had become a graveyard for the living. The group of survivors, though frightened and weary, knew they had no choice but to move forward. The infection had spread too quickly, and it was only a matter of time before the last pockets of resistance were consumed by the undead. If the cure was real, if it was their only hope, they had to find it. The city's medical research facility, where the antidote was rumored to be hidden, was their last chance. Armed with whatever makeshift weapons they could find, pipes, crowbars, old hunting rifles, and even a couple of kitchen knives, they set out, moving cautiously through the streets. Every step felt like a risk, but they had to take it. The air was thick with tension, and the feeling of danger lurked around every corner. They had already learned the hard way that staying silent and moving swiftly was their best chance at survival. The zombies had sharp senses. They could hear the slightest sound, smell the faintest whiff of human flesh, and once they locked onto a target, they were relentless. The journey was long and treacherous. The streets, once familiar, now felt like foreign terrain, filled with horrors lurking in every shadow. The first few blocks were relatively quiet, but as they moved deeper into the city, the true scale of the disaster became apparent. They passed by abandoned cars, some overturned, others still with their doors wide open, as if the occupants had left in a hurry, only to never return. Glass shattered on the ground, evidence of the destruction that had unfolded in the wake of the outbreak. The city, which had once been a thriving hub of life, now felt like a tomb. They came across bodies, some still twitching, others in various stages of decay. The survivors tried not to look too closely, tried to focus on the goal ahead, but it was impossible to ignore the horrors they passed. A man in a suit lay sprawled on the sidewalk, his face frozen in terror, his chest torn open. A woman clutched a small child in her arms, both victims of the merciless undead. They had no time to grieve for the fallen. The group kept moving, step by step, trying to stay as low profile as possible. Every alley was a potential danger zone. Some zombies were still slow and lumbering, while others were quicker, their movements jerky and erratic. The survivors learned quickly that it wasn't just about avoiding them, it was about outsmarting them. They took detours through abandoned buildings, navigating through back doors and alleyways when possible. When they were forced to cross an open street, they did so quickly, ducking behind cars or any cover they could find. There was no room for mistakes. As they neared the medical facility, their nerves were on edge. The building was supposed to be one of the last places to fall, a symbol of science and hope that had remained untouched for as long as possible. But now, even it was on the brink of collapse. The windows were shattered, and the door was wide open, inviting them in. Or so it seemed. It felt like a trap, but they had no choice but to push forward. The facility was their best shot at finding the cure, and they had come this far. Inside, the air was stale, the scent of dust and rot heavy in the air. The facility, which should have been pristine and sterile, was now a labyrinth of abandoned equipment and cluttered rooms. Broken glass crunched underfoot, and the walls were covered in peeling paint, signs of neglect. The survivors moved cautiously, checking every corner, staying alert for any signs of danger. The faint sound of groaning echoed from somewhere deeper within the building, and they knew the undead were not far behind. It was at that moment they realized they weren't alone. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled upon a group of survivors huddled in a makeshift camp, their faces weary and filled with suspicion. This group had been here longer than the survivors, and they had claimed the facility as their own. They weren't looking. The two groups eyed each other warily. The survivors, who had just arrived, exhausted and desperate for answers, didn't trust these newcomers, and for good reason. These people weren't interested in finding a cure. They were using the situation to strengthen their own position. They were armed, some with more advanced weapons than the survivors had, and they made it clear that they wouldn't tolerate any interference. "You're not welcome here," one of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, said coldly. His hand rested on the grip of a rifle slung over his shoulder. "This place is ours now. We're not handing it over." The tension was thick, and for a moment, the group of survivors feared they might have to fight their way in. They had come so far, only to be stopped by another group of desperate humans, each willing to do whatever it took to survive. But as the situation escalated, something unexpected happened. One of the survivors, a woman who had been standing in the back of the group, stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was soft but firm, and she looked directly at the scarred man. "We're not here for your supplies." "You think we haven't been trying to find it," he sneered. "We've searched this whole building. There's nothing here but more death." The group of survivors knew they were running out of time. The sound of moaning zombies could be heard echoing closer, growing louder with each passing second. They didn't have the luxury of time for a standoff. "We'll help you fight them off," Jason, the mechanic, spoke up, his voice full of determination. "But we need access to the lab. We need to find that cure." For a long moment, it seemed like the other group would refuse, but then the scarred man sighed, dropping his rifle to the ground. "Fine, but we're sticking together. No one gets left behind." With that uneasy truce, both groups moved deeper into the medical facility. The facility that had once been a symbol of hope had now become a battleground for survival. As the survivors ventured deeper into the building, they realized that finding the cure would be harder than they had anticipated. The place was crawling with undead, and worse still, it was becoming clear that the facility held more than just the potential for a cure. It held dark secrets, and some of those secrets might be more dangerous than the undead themselves. The journey for the cure had only just begun, and already the price of survival was steep. It was clear now that survival wasn't enough. For the survivors, it had stopped being about finding a safe place, hoarding food, and running from the undead. It had become something bigger. It had become a mission, an impossible fight to stop the madness that had consumed their world. What started as a desperate search for the cure had evolved into a battle to preserve what little humanity was left. In the end, the survivors knew there was no escaping the chaos, no hiding from the infected, no running to safety. It was time to make a stand. The medical facility had been their final hope, the place where the cure was rumored to be. But now, it felt like a prison. The once bright hallways were now darkened by the constant sound of scratching, growling, and the soft shuffle of the undead as they crept closer. They had come so far, fought so hard to get here, but with each passing moment, the walls seemed to close in tighter. It wasn't just the zombies surrounding them anymore. It was the crushing weight of desperation, the realization that for all their efforts, there might be no escape. The survivors had learned quickly that there was no real safety. Every room they barricaded, every door they closed, would eventually be breached. They couldn't hide forever. It wasn't just about the cure anymore. The undead were closing in, and they were determined to stop them, no matter the cost. Jason, Megan, Samuel, Mark, and the rest of the group had spent hours preparing for the inevitable. They fortified their position in the lab, pushing furniture against doors, securing windows with any materials they could find. They had gathered everything they could: guns, knives, pipes, and anything that could be used as a weapon. They were ready for a fight. But none of them knew just how brutal that fight would be. As the night wore on, the sound of the undead grew louder. First, it was a few stray zombies. Then it was more. Dozens, maybe hundreds, pressing in from all sides. The building was surrounded. It was only a matter of time before they would break through. But the survivors weren't going down without a fight. They'd come this far. They had to make this stand count. The first wave hit hard. The zombies were relentless, crashing against the makeshift barricades, clawing at the doors and windows, their rotting hands reaching through every crack they could find. The survivors had no choice but to fight back. Megan and Jason moved first, taking positions at the front, firing their guns at the approaching horde. Samuel threw a Molotov cocktail he'd crafted from the few supplies they had found, sending a flaming bottle into the middle of a group of zombies, lighting them on fire and buying the group a few precious seconds. But the battle wasn't easy. No matter how many zombies they took down, more kept coming. The survivors were exhausted, their limbs heavy with fatigue, their eyes bloodshot from days of stress and fear. Every shot they fired felt like it was draining them. Every time a zombie fell, another seemed to take its place. It was a never-ending onslaught, and yet they fought with everything they had. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the chance to change the course of history. They were fighting for the future of humanity, for the possibility that the world could be saved from the nightmare they had all found themselves in. But with each passing hour, it became clearer that this battle was more than just physical. It was a fight for hope, for belief in something more than the horrors they had already seen. Jason and Megan were firing relentlessly, picking off zombies as they advanced. But it wasn't just the guns that kept them alive. It was the bond between them, the unspoken understanding that no matter what, they couldn't give up. Samuel had taken to wielding a crowbar, using it to crush skulls in close combat, his eyes wild with determination. Mark, the scientist, had used his knowledge to create makeshift traps, setting explosives in doorways and windows to slow down the zombies. They worked as one unit, each person doing their part, knowing that there was no room for failure. Hours passed, and the sound of the battle was deafening. The building was filled with the stench of blood and decay, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. The survivors' faces were covered in sweat and grime, their clothes torn and bloodied. It seemed like the night would never end, but they kept fighting. Then, just when it seemed like the last wave of zombies had been pushed back, a new danger appeared. A group of hostile survivors, armed and desperate, had arrived at the facility. They were not interested in finding a cure. They were interested in hoarding whatever supplies they could get their hands on, no matter who they had to kill to get it. They had been watching the group for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with the zombies distracted, they had come to take whatever they could to push the survivors out and claim the medical facility for themselves. The two groups clashed violently. The survivors, already exhausted from hours of fighting the undead, now had to contend with humans who were just as desperate, just as willing to do whatever it took to survive. The firefight was brutal. Guns firing, people shouting, and the sickening sound of bodies hitting the floor. But despite the chaos, the survivors held their ground. Megan took the lead, rallying the group, firing her pistol with precision and coordinating the defense. Jason and Samuel fought back to back, covering each other's blind spots. Mark, though weakened from his injuries, held his ground, setting traps for the hostile survivors, buying them just enough time to hold their position. It was a fight for their lives. And as the hours dragged on, the group began to realize the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to end the madness, to stop the spread of the infection, to prevent the nightmare from reaching the rest of the world. But the cost was high. One by one, the survivors began to fall. Samuel, in his desperation to hold the line, was caught by a zombie's bite, the infection spreading too quickly for him to survive. Jason, who had fought so fiercely, was struck by a bullet from one of the hostile survivors. Megan and Mark, the last two standing, fought tooth and nail, trying to keep the infected at bay and finish the battle. But the truth was clear. There would be no easy victory. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the battle stopped. The zombies, though not entirely defeated, had been pushed back far enough for the survivors to finally access the lab and retrieve the cure. But the cost was high. The building was in ruins, and Denver was lost. The survivors who had fought so hard to protect it had given their lives to the cause. The world, as they had known it, was gone. Mark and Megan stood amidst the ruins, their bodies battered and broken, their hearts heavy with loss. They had found the cure, but it came at a price they had never expected to pay. The rest of the world would never know what had happened in Denver. But the survivors knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. There was still hope, still a chance to stop the madness from spreading. But now, it was their responsibility to ensure it never happened again. The battle for humanity's survival wasn't just a fight against the undead. It was a fight against the dark forces that had brought the world to its knees. And the survivors knew they would have to keep fighting, because the war for the future had only just begun.